So before we start, I do have a second channel. So if you are interested in more content that isn't related to anime and manga, consider going over there and subscribing. Also, if you end up enjoying this video, consider leaving a like. I'd greatly appreciate it. So I want to have a nice, easy, simple conversation about Yuji Itadori currently. For myself, I'm very interested to see where his story actually goes, not only in the grand scheme of things, but him as an individual, his mind, his emotions, and where he sits mentally, because as of all of the most recent stuff going into the Culling games, but more specifically Shibuya, there has been a massive shift. There's been a change within demeanor, a change with his approach, a change within his thought process. And while it's been very surface level at the moment, very simple, it's only starting to increase and gain more traction over time. There hasn't been a massive showcase for it as of yet, but I do believe we are building up to that point. Kind of all starts with Shibuya. Obviously prior Shibuya and kind of building the foundation for it to shatter and break right in front of his eyes. But Shibuya is where it kicks off and where you kind of see the reality of what he has to deal with, how he hides it away, and the kind of thought process that he puts himself through to either justify certain actions or certain responses, but also how he carries himself. For me, anything regarding Yuji and his mentality is a rather interesting conversation to have. So, with that said, let's begin. I think the best place to start for Yuji is how he was introduced into the story, the character that he lives up to, the personality, the bright, vibrant nature that he brings across. Even though he's been introduced through death and destruction and kind of misery in a sense, he's always had this very beautiful personality about himself, one that is intoxicating and addicting, and you see the positivity kind of blurred out from it. He's always had this resilience mentally and emotionally, this fortitude, this structure around himself where feeling certain emotions is kind of like his biggest weakness, his biggest downfall, and it's kind of reiterated through certain fights where he has to keep composed, where he has to keep his mentality in check and his emotions in check specifically, so he doesn't either lose strength or lose the ability to do what needs to be done, but also contributing to that idea that he doesn't lose himself, that he doesn't go out of control, that he doesn't take a wrong step, because within the world of sorcery, and this is something that he learns, one wrong step can end it all. And we know this is something that Yuji isn't directly scared of, but when it comes to his friends, when it comes to people that are close to him, it hurts. It's a difficult pill to swallow. He wants to try to save everyone with the power that he has, but the power that he has is just as deathly and misery driven as how he was introduced into the story, and that power being Sukuna, which kind of paints this very contrasted picture between, ironically enough, light and darkness. If Yuji is this beautiful, vibrant, very fun, lovable individual that is very carefree with how he was introduced, Sukuna is the complete opposite. Death, destruction, misery, pain, any sort of descriptive word that you could make that has a negative connotation towards it, that is Sukuna. So you balance them out quite heavily. I think what's great about Sukuna being so obnoxious in this front, and something that Akatami has purposefully withdrawn from actually showcasing, is the subtle emotional and mental manipulation that Sukuna puts Yuji through. We know it's there. It's very little, it's very minuscule, but it is enough to kind of put doubt within Yuji, to second guess himself, to question certain situations where originally he wouldn't. He now has a power that technically isn't his own, that is very intoxicating, that is very demonic in a sense. Not only is it viewed demonically from third-party sources, everyone outside of it being Yuji, but Yuji himself starts to see it in that sense as well, where he wants to benefit his side, where he doesn't want to use Sukuna's ability, and that kind of changes the, I guess, character type or architecture that a lot of people are very comfortable with, a main character having a demonic presence or being inside of them. In some way, shape or form, usually the main main character would heavily rely on this person, or they would somewhat try to get along. They would create some sort of bond or relationship. This is not the case for Yuji. If anything, the closest thing to their bond is quite literally a contract, one that Yuji has no memory of, and one that increasingly spirals out of control, that affects Yuji the more Sukuna gets powerful. This builds up over time within the background. It's something that doesn't take the main spotlight specifically because it's very difficult to do, and you can kind of understand why Akutami wanted to avoid this mental and emotional kind of conflict between very polarizing opposites, that is Yuji and Sukuna, because there would be a lot of attention that needs to be shown to that. To play upon it respectfully and with the most importance, it definitely could be done, and Akutami has done smaller variations of it, but with the amount that would have to go into Yuji and Sukuna, it would take a lot of time and a lot of detail. Something that Jujutsu Kaisen's grand narrative doesn't really have room for. So we put it within the background. We slowly trickle in that breadcrumb. We slowly trickle in that appeal until it reaches a breaking point. It boils over time. It increases, but not enough for you to kind of question what's going on. Not enough for you to kind of hate the idea or completely fall in love with it, but one that you acknowledge that is there, but you don't really create a whole conversation from it. This all changes, however, when we reach Shibuya. This is where Yuji changes. This is where the perspective towards Sukuna and Yuji's dynamic specifically also changes. And this is because Yuji himself recognizes the absolute death and destruction that Sukuna brings across, because he experiences this emotional overload firsthand. This is the first time that this happens for him. He knew Sukuna was powerful, yet Yuji played a very coy and playful attitude around him, but now he has experienced it firsthand. And you see how desperate Yuji is. You see how confused and distraught and kind of emotionally fueled he is. When he sees the absolute death and carnage and destruction that is brought upon through his body by Sukuna, he can't help but blame himself. He could obviously quite easily blame Sukuna, but it's never really that simple. Because Yuji has this pride and this confidence in keeping Sukuna under control, when he does come out to play, when he does cause all of these catastrophic events, Yuji is the one that gets hurt. He feels like he's failed. He feels like he wasn't good enough or wasn't strong enough to withhold Sukuna's presence. In a sense, this slowly dehumanizes Yuji, the way he thinks about things, the kind of approach. So while he still may have pockets of these very bright and bubbly personality moments, you'll notice this severity within fights specifically, or encounters. He is very strict. His whole attitude, his whole emotional response to things is almost hollow completely. It's almost like he's scared to become emotionally fueled in any sort of regard, because Sukuna may latch onto that. This also kind of stems from the encounter that he has with Shibuya, because not only does the emotional overload of seeing the destruction that inadvertently he has caused, he also sees the death of someone that's extremely close to him. That death ripples through his core. It changes him. This is the first time that he has experienced something so deeply traumatizing. But then just to capitalize on that, it's by someone that he has a rivalry with, someone that he's wanted to take out for a very long time. And don't get me wrong, the first kind of death that he's experienced by Mahito is still definitely traumatizing, but you can kind of use those two different points as actuators, as comparisons even. The first time he sees it, he goes out of control. All of this rage and emotion drowns him, and he becomes very powerful because of it. He lets all of this negative energy flow through him, and it reflects within that fight. Yet the person that reels him back, the person that brings him to reality within that first fight, is none other than the person that gets obliterated the second time. The person that kept him under control, the person that helped him maneuver these emotions and his feelings, has just died in front of his eyes by the person that he has so much hatred for. Could you imagine how desperately he would want to lose control? How desperately he would want to kind of take everything and just blow it up to such a massive extent. So it's honestly both equally impressive but super sad that none of that happens. Instead, he becomes so tunnel visioned on Mahito that his emotions become so blurry and all over the place, to the point where he's losing. He gets into that fight. He approaches it. He wants to obliterate this person, yet his emotions emotions are so stunted and kind of forced against the wall where they will not come out whatsoever, because he's been taught not to bring them out. Not only does it make him less efficient, but it puts him on the cusp of being killed very easily. Especially when you're up against a character like Mahito, that's something that should never be done. Especially the person that he just witnessed be killed that taught him all of these things, to keep his composure, to channel it in a way that is powerful. He obviously couldn't do that properly. So you see him within that Mahito fight lose control. You see him lose, in a sense. It's a great fight. It's very enjoyable, but something happens as soon as Todo comes into the picture. Todo picks him back up from a place of confusion. Not fully, but enough for Yuji to regain control, to regain his composure and to push past everything that has just littered his mind prior. But he husks over it, almost like he forces it within the background, because one, that's kind of what he has to do, but two, you see it reflected in everything after. It goes to the point of reiterating it by witnessing Nobara being heavily injured and potentially even killed in Yuji's mind. And while he gets some sort of reassurance for it in terms of Todo saying that she could be saved, his mind is complete and utterly focused on Mahito. Their fight is a beautiful amalgamation of all of these feelings, ones that Yuji cannot directly express. So when you see the climatic finale for it, when you see both of these characters fighting at their hardest, and even what Todo sacrifices within this fight, as for me, Todo was very important, keeping Yuji level-headed, kind of like his humanity at this point. Once that disappears, you see kind of sheer void that Yuji has become. Everything that he has shut off has been kind of funneled and redirected back to Mahito. And it's such an incredible and beautiful reversal of roles. When Mahito has always been so playful and all over the place and kind of scary in a lot of different fronts, and now you see him so desperate, almost withering within the ground, almost scared to look up at Yuji and the demonic aura that Yuji has. This isn't Sukuna that Mahito is scared of. This isn't anyone else's power or mentality or aura or emotion that Mahito is scared of. This is Yuji's mentality. This is Yuji's emotions, his power. And for the first time, and the reason why Shibuya is so powerful and valuable in terms of this moment and its climax, for the first time Yuji recognizes what he is. He recognizes the equality between himself and Mahito, and how they are two opposing sides of the same coin. Within this moment, he is willing and wanting to kill Mahito, to take his life, regardless of how human-like he can be. The amount of misery that he has brought upon through Yuji and everyone else throughout the story, Yuji was ready to take Mahito's life and to kill him then and there, to show him just how far he's truly come. Unfortunately, we don't get that payoff, which is kind of the most tragic thing about it. Not in the sense of storytelling, because it's very purposeful and beautiful in the sense of storytelling, but for Yuji, it's tragic. He couldn't get that closure. He couldn't kill or obliterate or decimate the person that has caused this much pain. Everything after Shibuya and heading obviously into the Culling Games makes for a very interesting perspective. You've seen that he's changed. You've seen how he approaches situations, even though it's slightly, you can tell with his facial expressions. You can tell with how he kind of upholds himself now. So yes, you'll still see little bits and pieces of bright moments and him being comedic and humorous, but deep down I feel like he's losing control. He's losing sight of himself, and the further we get into the Culling Games, the further that notion actually gets pushed, because he has no real way to deal with the trauma that he's experienced, the death of someone that was so evidently close to him, the heavily injured of his best friend even, and someone that he's worked so hard with, obviously being Nobara, not being able to get the closure of killing Mahito, and the event that is the Culling Game being caused directly by Mahito, obviously through Kenjaku. This is still all lingering. This is still fresh within Yuji's head, and he has not had the time to decipher it, to pull it apart, to grieve, to emotionally understand it. So it is boiling, it is bubbling, and it's almost becoming a point of no return. I don't think he will go insane or out of control or lose sight of himself, but you can see how he thinks about things now. You can see him question things bit by bit. He is breaking and cracking down. He is kind of devaluing himself, his own worth, his own identity. I mean, just recently he identified himself as just being a cog cog within a much bigger wheel that is very much close in the sense of being a martyr, being someone that is self-sacrificial, a pawn. These are all things that he is, and the fact that he ponders on it and recognizes it and understands that Sukuna inside of him is very detrimental. He's kind of just coasting at the moment. He's pushing forward within the culling games, but at what cost? How far is his mental state going to be pushed against very powerful people that Sukuna may actually know? How much more will Sukuna potentially torment him in that vein? Because of all of this, you've probably noticed that massive shift in tone and atmosphere. The self-worth of individuals, their identity, has constantly been questioned throughout that shift. Maki is a great example of it being showcased to the fullest. Megami himself is somewhat struggling with it currently. Yuji has been struggling with it since Shibuya. It's trickling in bit by bit, and you can tell how suffocating it is, just with how they kind of approach different fights within the most recent stuff. The real question is, how far will Akutami take this? How far will they take Yuji, Megami, Maki, Yuta, Hakari, Panda, basically everyone in this situation currently? I am more than positive that there is some very heartbreaking, emotional, but amazing things on the way. When it comes to the culling games, all of these characters, and Yuji Itadori specifically. At this point in time, we'll just have to wait and see. Endtime. So welcome to the end of the video. If you have made it this far, I would like to thank you. I appreciate you. But please let me know how you feel about Yuji Itadori. How do you feel about his mental health currently? Do you feel like he's a little all over the place? Do you feel like he's spiraling out of control or on the verge of breaking? There's some very interesting ways that Akutami can go, and I obviously couldn't be more excited to see what actually comes from it. Let me know how you feel down below. But with all of that, I want to thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Leave a like and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. Drink plenty of water, and I will see you within the next one. Goodbye.